The emergence of classical philosophy. Logic and reasoning. While ancient Greece, with philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, is often credited as the birthplace of Western philosophy, the development of classical philosophy actually spans multiple regions. It began in North Africa, moved through Greece and Rome, then returned across the Mediterranean, spreading from Persia to Spain, before influencing modern thought. This chapter explores the historical journey of philosophy across these diverse cultures and examines how philosophers have studied and practiced philosophy throughout history. And so we're seeing multiple places like North Africa, Greece and Rome, the Mediterranean, Persia, Spain, etc. Concerning our terminology, contextualist approach is an approach to the philosophy that interprets the ideas of philosophers in terms of the historical and cultural contexts in which they wrote. Empiricism is a belief that all knowledge is derived inductively from sense experience. Hermeneutic approach is an approach to philosophy that takes the historical context of the original text seriously, but it also recognizes the influence of contemporary issues and perspectives. Logos is the thoughts of God, which according to Philo of Alexandria serve as the means by which God creates the physical world. Little note on hermeneutical approach. Hermeneutics recognizes that the historical context of the original text is important because it was in that historical context and that culture and time and place that the text was written, and those influenced the writers of the time. And how in our present day we have many different biases that inhibit us from actually having a true understanding of the times in which the person lived and things of that nature. Monism is the belief that the universe is made up of one substance. Natural philosophy is the fields of study that eventually gave rise to science. Pluralism is the belief that the universe is made up of more than one substance. Presentist approach is an approach to philosophy that examines philosophical texts for the arguments that they contain and judges how and whether they remain relevant today. Theory of the forms is a metaphysical doctrine that holds that every particular thing that exists in our changing material world participates in an immaterial form or essence, which is unchanging, immutable, invisible, and perfect, and which gives this thing its identity. And then there are Zeno's paradoxes, which are paradoxes proposed by Zeno that attempt to prove that change and motion are illusory. Historiographical and the history of philosophy. Scholars approach the history of philosophy in three main ways. The presentist approach evaluates philosophical text based on their relevance to current philosophical issues, but it also risks judging past thinkers by modern standards and making anachronistic errors. The anachronistic terminology really started with the Renaissance, Italian Renaissance historians in the 14th century. Contextualist approach interprets philosophical works within their historical and cultural context, providing deep historical understanding but potentially overlooking the enduring values of the ideas. Then there is the hermeneutic approach, which combines both methods of the presentist approach and the contextualist approach, and it does this by considering historical context while also acknowledging that our interpretation is influenced by contemporary perspectives. Classical philosophy, classical Greek philosophy was influenced by Egyptian and Babylonian scholarship, and so the pre-Socratic philosophers, those before Plato and Aristotle, explored metaphysics and natural philosophy, with monists like Parmenides and pluralists like Heraclitus. Plato introduced the theory of forms, asserting that every tangible object derives its essence from an eternal, unchanging realm of ideal forms. Aristotle developed the doctrine of four causes, material, formal, efficient, and final, in order to explain the nature and purpose, or teleology, of all things, culminating in the concept of a prime mover as the universe's ultimate cause, and giving rise to the telos. Then there is Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophy. Greek and Roman imperialism in the Middle East and North Africa exposed the Jews and the Christians to Hellenistic thought, which they incorporated into their theological studies. Paul, the apostle of Christ, who wrote most of the majority of the New Testament, most Pauline scholars say that Paul was definitely influenced by Neoplatonism. And as the Muslim world expanded, it adopted and advanced classical philosophy and the natural sciences. However, A tension persisted as philosophers sought to balance theological revelation with the intellectual exploration. Of course, it was many of the Muslim scholars who adopted and advanced classical philosophy and the natural sciences who were the first to rediscover Aristotle and bring it back to the Western world. Unlike their Greek and Roman counterparts, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim philosophers worked alongside their religious beliefs, trying to reconcile their religious beliefs with those of the natural philosophy. And it was only during the early modern period that reason, rather than divine authority, became the primary source of truth in philosophy. Concerning logic and reason, logic is a crucial tool in philosophy. It is used to formalize and describe reasoning processes. It focuses on both how we reason and how we should reason. Logicians categorize and explain different types of successful reasoning, as well as mistakes to avoid, aiming to guide us in making correct reasoning choices. This section provides a general understanding of the discipline of logic. There's abductive logic, having to do with abductive reasoning. Abduction is probabilistic. It is a probabilistic form of inference in which an explanation is offered in order to justify and explain evidence. An ad hominem attack is a fallacy of relevance that argues against someone's idea or suggestion by attacking the individual personally, rather than actually pointing out problems with the idea or the claim or suggestion. An appeal to ignorance is a fallacy of weak induction that it relies on the lack of knowledge or evidence for a certain thing or our ignorance of it in order to draw a definite conclusion about that thing. An argument is a set of reasons offered in support of a conclusion. It's just good reasons to believe why something is true or not. Begging the question, a fallacy of unwarranted assumption that either assumes the truth of a conclusion in the course of trying to prove it, or it assumes the truth of a contentious claim. Biased sample is a fallacy of weak induction that draws a conclusion using evidence that is biased in some way. A conclusion, or conclusio, is the result of an argument. And so at most papers you'll have an introductio, you introduced what you're talking about, and of course your conclusion is the result of your argumentation process throughout the bulk of the writing. A conclusion is that which is meant to be proved by the reasoning and premises used in an argument. Conditional is a logical statement that expresses a necessary and a sufficient condition. Conditional statements, or conditionals for short, are usually formulated as if-then statements, like if this, then that. Contradiction, a statement that is always false. Contradiction is the conjunction of any statement and its negation. Counterexample, an example that proves that either a statement is false or an argument is invalid. Deductive, again, is different from abductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning has to do with deduction or deductive reasoning, while abduction is a form of inference and abductive reasoning. Of course, deduction is a form of inference that can guarantee the truth of its conclusions, given the truth of the premises, however. Emotional appeal is a fallacy of relevance that appeals to feelings, whether positive or negative, rather than the actual discussion of merits of an idea or proposal. Explanatory virtues are aspects of an explanation that generally make it strong. Four such virtues are that a good hypothesis should be explanatory, simple, and conservative, as well as having depth. A fallacy is a poor form of reasoning. A fallacy of diversion is a general category of informal fallacies in which an arguer presents evidence that functions to divert the attention of the audience from the actual current subject of the argument to another. Fallacy of relevance is a general category of informal fallacies in which an arguer relies on reasons that are not relevant for establishing a conclusion about what he or she is trying to say concerning the claim or statement that they make. A fallacy of unwarranted assumption is a general category of informal fallacies in which an arguer implicitly or explicitly relies on reasons that require further justification. Fallacy of weak induction is a general category of informal fallacies in which an arguer's evidence or reasons are too weak to firmly establish their conclusion or statement. False cause is a fallacy of weak induction in which a causal relation is assumed to exist between two events or things that are not causally connected. In this sense, correlation does not equal causation. A false dichotomy is a fallacy of unwarranted assumption in which a limited number of possibilities are assumed to be the only available options. A hasty generalization is a fallacy of weak induction that draws a conclusion using too little evidence to support the conclusion. A hypothesis is a Proposed explanation for an observed process or phenomenon. Inductive is having to do with induction or inductive reasoning. Induction is a probabilistic form of inference in which observation or experience is used in order to draw conclusions about the world. And inference is a reasoning process that moves from one idea to another, resulting in conclusions. Invalidity is a property of bad deductive inferences. An invalid inference or argument is one in which the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and therefore statement is false. Law of non-contradiction. This comes from Aristotle, a logical law that states that contradictory statements or propositions can never be true in the same sense at the same time. The law of the excluded middle is a logical law that states that for any statement, either that statement or its negation is true. Logical analysis is the process of determining whether the logical inferences made in an argument are good or not. A logical analysis determines whether the premises in an argument logically support the conclusion or the statement being made. A necessary condition, for example, X is a necessary condition for Y. If and only if X must be true. Premise. Evidence or a reason offered in support of a conclusion, statement, or claim. A red herring is a fallacy of diversion that ignores the opponent's position and simply changes the subject. A statement is a sentence with a truth value, a sentence that must be either true or false. A straw man is a fallacy of diversion that utilizes a weaker version of the position being argued against in order to make the position easier to defeat. Sufficient condition. X is a sufficient condition for Y if and only if the truth of X guarantees the truth of Y. If X is sufficient for Y, then the truth of X is enough to prove the truth of Y. Truth analysis. The process of determining whether statements made in an argument are either true or false. A universal affirmative statement are statements that take two groups of things and claim all members of the first group are also members of the second group. Validity is a property of deductive arguments where the structure of an argument is such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. A valid inference is a logically good inference. Philosophical methods for discovering truth. Logic is the study of reasoning and plays a key role in discovering truth in philosophy and other disciplines. Early philosophers used what's called dialectics, which are reasoned debates aimed at getting closer to the truth, and these debates often begin with the question followed by scrutiny of the answer. You will find many of these, for example, in Plato's dialogues. Plato's complete works has all of his dialogues, including the Republic and many more. Logic is used to test hypotheses and includes laws such as the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. You will find a lot that in Aristotle's section on logic. And of course, logic tests hypotheses such as the law of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle, which act as rules for how we should reason, and these laws are normative rules guiding us on how we ought to think. Logical statements can be conditionals or universal affirmative statements, both of which express logical relations of necessity and sufficiency. A sufficient condition always guarantees something else, while a necessary condition is always required for something else. In order to prove a conditional or universal affirmative statement false, you must provide a counter-example, demonstrating that the necessary and sufficient conditions do not hold. Concerning arguments, an argument consists of premises, which are reasons offered or to support a conclusion, or reason to believe why something is true. To evaluate an argument, you assess both the truth of the premises and the logic of the reasoning. Logical evaluation focuses on whether the premises logically support the conclusion through valid inferences. Reasoning that connects ideas to form the conclusion. So we're thinking about reason, and we're thinking about ideas, and we're thinking about forms of the argument. There's certain form to arguments. There are three types of inferences: deductive inference, inductive inference, and abductive. So deductive, inductive, and abductive. Deductive inferences, when valid, guarantee the truth of the conclusion, but invalid ones cannot. Inductive inferences based on observations provide probable support for a conclusion. Abductive inferences, or inference to the best explanation, offer probable explanations for accepted evidence. And then we have informal fallacies. A fallacy is a poor reasoning. and informal fallacies cannot be reduced to an argument's structure or form. They can be categorized into 4 types. First, fallacies of relevance, where irrelevant evidence is presented. Second, fallacies of weak induction, where relevant evidence is too weak to support the conclusion. 3, fallacies of unwarranted assumption, where further justification is needed for a claim used as evidence. And fourth, fallacies of diversion, where the arguer distracts the audience from the argument at hand. And so we have certain informal fallacies, like fallacies of relevance, fallacies of weak induction, fallacies of unwarranted assumption, and fallacies of diversion. In our next reading and section, we will talk about metaphysics. We will talk about certain topics within metaphysics.